Um, the title I chose was Living in a Viral Age, What Next for the Urban Night? Um, actually, before I go on into the main talk, I'd like to say how impressed I've been with the quality of the research that's been presented. And that's also one of the other reasons why I didn't want to talk for very long, was because I haven't got any new empirical research to present, but I hope to have some next year. So this is a more frameworky type of presentation. And the reason I chose this topic is because I do have a new research project, and I haven't been able to really get going on the fieldwork, as many of you other presenters have said, because of COVID. And this topic will actually, hopefully, it's already helped me pulling the course together, the talk together, and will help set up the framework for the empirical research. So yes, I'm retired. I'm not a physical grandmother, but I might be a sort of virtual grandmother in that sense. And I have something called a Leverhulme Emeritus Fellowship Award, which is an end of career project. And in it, I wanted to combine my main discipline of urban design with my specialism in the urban night. And urban design, because I don't think there's many other urban studies, urban planners on this in this conference. Just to explain, it's been described as a mongrel discipline, and it is kind of generalist specialist discipline, somewhere between architecture and town planning. And as Matthew Carmona says, it's about the process of shaping places for people. So it's a bit like three-dimensional town planning, in that urban designers, like architects, plan forward for the future. They set out frameworks and master plans that aim to shape the development of places. And so they're particularly concerned with urban form, with transport, with landscape, and the shape and the size and the uses, and as we'll go on to see, the practices and behaviours of the way in which people use places. So the project is that brings together urban design and urban night is focused first of all on the conventional literature review, but will include a critique of the design guidance that's given by government and by, in urban design textbooks, by colleagues, on how we approach urban design, and particularly urban design that's looking to create new settlements or new extensions to existing towns and cities. And to focus it further, so it's got a theoretical element and a practical element. And the practical element is then the fieldwork will be focused on 5 different specific places in the UK, well, actually in England, and they are taking either towns that are going to have significant urban extensions of 10,000, 20,000 dwellings. So it's, like two neighborhoods or 3 neighborhoods, or there's going to be specific regeneration. And so at the time I thought about the project, I thought it would be good to look at small and medium-sized towns, as there's been a lot of work on the major central cities. But of course, as many people have found, when you're studying the urban night in smaller town centres, the draw of the bigger centre that's further away from you is also important. So in the case of Croydon, it's near London, and Stockport near Manchester. And as we've seen from this conference, the extent of research on the urban night is very, very rich. We started off, I've been involved in it for about 2 decades now, and we started with regulation and governance, and also looking at exclusion, but and the infrastructure of the urban night, the kind of services, the kind of buildings that are available. And as the, if you like, the field has progressed, we've moved into other areas such as the segmentation of the urban night, the way that there are different urban nights for different demographics and in different places, quite often in the same city. And we also have had now a lot of literature, particularly thinking of Tim Edensaw, talking about darkness and light. I know you've just come out from a session on that, about atmosphere, about effect. And we're also moving into biodiversity and the impact of increased lighting, increased activity on the natural world, which is something I haven't looked at in great detail yet, but I think is becoming more and more important as we look at things like climate change. And then, of course, we've had a lot of interesting papers in this conference and elsewhere on informal aspects of the urban night. First of all, starting with you know, when the field first opened up, talking about illegal activities, the rave culture, and now that very interesting paper on Mexico and Tijuana about the street sellers and other aspects of informality in the urban night. So there's this big richness that moves beyond the original focus, which was on nightlife and the nighttime economy. But within nighttime economy research, I was privileged to sit on a data gathering, or the original setup for data gathering for the Greater London Authority, with the research they did to produce their most recent policy. And when the economists really got down to drilling down into what do we mean by the nighttime economy, what kind of economies run at night, they and we were quite surprised about the relative limitations of seeing nightlife purely through leisure, hospitality and entertainment. And I know Julius, who's on the call here, has talked about has done a lot of research on the activities, other activities, the night workers in distribution markets. We also have the other activities that support nighttime and leisure activities, fashion, the supply chains, the hotels, the visitor economy and tourism. And although it's a small bubble on this diagram, we were really surprised in London to find how large the 24-hour health and personal services were. And this has come to the fore in the pandemic, as we realize how many social care and medical workers are moving around at night and going to work, and how the absolute importance of them, and also the importance of the services that you know, actually you sort of feed them, like 24-hour supermarkets and so on. As Sadiq Khan pointed out, you know, a snack, you know, a late night snack to us at midnight might be a doctor's lunch or a nurse's lunch. So one of the things that I found difficult in terms of urban design was the kind of normalization of most urban design proposals, and the way, in fact, when you make a proposal, it has to project forward how a place should be in a very static way. You know, you're setting out places, buildings, the pattern, the layout of pattern of buildings, streets, roads, major land uses, parks, and so on. And this has been an issue for urban designers about how we envisage place and space and take in the co-constitution with people. And I found Kim Dovey's work very, very useful. He's a professor in Melbourne, Australia. And he talks about whether place can be seen as immanent or transcendent, whether we see it as purely embodied, or not purely, that it's embodied in everyday life, or drawing on the theme which many urban designers like Christian Norbuck-Schultz talks about, the idea of the genius loci, the spirit of the place. And we think of spirit of the place in terms of people like, of places like Ayers Rock, or, you know, Bath, places with very strong urban forms. And he's putting forward a more dynamic, looser understanding of place, which can be, as he points out, could be construed as a kind of using assemblage theory between parts, practices, and meanings. So to translate that into more graphic terms, form, I think we can understand through morphology and layout and concentration and activities. And then the practices is a very common term we use in the social sciences in terms of thinking of repetitive behavior, and also occasional types of ritual. So we have the repetitive behavior of going home, work, cycling, walking, those and some certain leisure activities. But then we also have the more spectacular practices or unusual practices. And this slide shows people looking at a memorial. And then meanings we are more fluid, but and they also can be ascribed quite differently by different demographics through atmosphere effect, etc., to the same place. This is on the left-hand side is a slide showing the meaning of Brixton as being a particular location, the Dog Star pub, which used to be the Atlantic, and how, you know, amazing it was when Grandmaster Flash really did play there. And that's obviously, that has that kind of meaning and sense of place attachment to the person who posted it on their blog. But then there's also a reminder of the other sorts of meaning. And this is on the bottom right-hand side, is the footage from a bus camera, CCTV. And it was a very shocking incident that happened in England during lockdown in March this year, when a young woman was approached by a plainclothes policeman, told that she was subverting lockdown regulations by being out. And then he subsequently abducted her, handcuffed her, abducted her, raped her, and murdered her. So an ordinary suburban street between Brixton and another place in South London becomes a place of terror and acquires a quite different meaning. And I've done some analysis of the urban design guidance in the mainstream. And what is striking about the mainstream guidance and manuals is how many, virtually all the illustrations are of daytime, whether they be computer visualizations, photographs, whatever else. There's also a very limited view of leisure. Leisure is thought of as going to the pub, even though it's been in decline since the beginning of the 19th century in the UK, using parks and green spaces, and occasionally possibly a cultural venue. Very little attention paid to what happens at the night. absolutely no mention of night workers and their need to use urban spaces. And although informality is encouraged through things like, these fountains, which you'll find in many remodeled public spaces throughout the world now, informality in the urban night is not recognized, and not accounted for. Um, There are some exceptions. Barton's book actually does talk about the social capital through providing a wider variety of meeting places. There's a very good edited collection by Novus Davidian on urban lighting. And the series from the Town and Country Planning Association, who are the practice and theoretical bodies that support garden cities, um, does emphasize the importance of culture, cultural venues, and the arts. But the overall impression of the urban environment is generally rather sanitized and rather safe, and not at all related to any of the discussion in this conference. So COVID has had an impact on the topic of the research, because how do you project forward guidance about the urban night without thinking about what, what has happened to it with COVID, and how will that have an impact, and how should we advise anybody who is planning or designing a new settlement or a major new extension to a settlement. And so we've had in the UK the kind of impacts that other people have talked about, temporary closures, recognition of night workers. 54 bus drivers actually died during the first lockdown in the UK, in London, which was very shocking. Working from home. Oddly enough, we had a shorter opening hours of shops. And in common with other places, we had an increased use of parks and green spaces, increase in cycling, social distancing and march wearing. And I think the other thing to say is we had very, very confusing regulations, and we came in and out of lockdown and in different tiers and different regulations, and they were really difficult to understand. And the impact on nightlife has been, well, we still don't know, but the forecasts are not good, particularly for nightclubs, to the extent that in March this year, the Nightlife Industries Association provided the secretariat for a government all-party informal grouping, but nevertheless recognised within the British Parliament. And they've been arguing for support for nightlife, which has not been enough, according to the Nighttime Industries Association. But certainly in February and March, the forecasts that were given were pretty gloomy. And certainly nightlife businesses have had to make 37% of their workforce redundant. There's been a further big impact on the pub trade, less so on bar restaurants, but also closure in bars. So concerns about that. But at the same time, the recent trend has been to better governance, and the nighttime czars in the big cities of Manchester, and London, and now Bristol, are now saying they want to protect nightlife, and particularly to encourage diversity. And in the case of Manchester, this phrase, build back better. How can we do it better in the future? So theoretically, well, actually, we did come out of lockdown on the 21st of June, which was actually quite early this year, 2021. And it was very kind of gradual, and we're still really assessing the impact. But the other issue associated with the UK is Brexit, which is leading to all sorts of unforeseen, well, some people would say they're foreseen, but impacts such as food shortages, petrol shortages, because there aren't enough tankers. And meanwhile, there's still the concern about COVID. Will it rise again? There was a spike in Devon and Cornwall when there was a big festival, and there was fears that the hospitals would become overwhelmed. And this fear is still around. There's forecasts of a spike in COVID and hospitalizations at the end of this month. So we still don't know precisely what's going to happen. So I've suggested 3 scenarios for this that could be there, and I'll just go through them. The first is stay at home, a retreat from the urban night. The second, and I've been involved in webinars where we've been talking about the future of the high street, and one economist said, no, it's quite simple, we'll just go back to the way we were before, the pre-pandemic levels. And we've heard in the conference other people talking about the new normal. So evidence for arguments for stay at home. Well, there will be a fall in disposable income and decreased spend on hospitality and entertainment outside the home. There's an expansion of deliveries to home delivery of food and alcohol that's still continuing. Expansion of online retail will also have an impact. Expansion of home entertainment services, decline of city centres, and a potential decline in face-to-face meetings of all types. Some evidence, this actually only goes to 2020, but online retail has increased and the number of visits to in-person to shops has decreased, and it's accelerated a trend for shopping in city centres to close. And so there are big holes in many UK city centres and less reasons for people to come in or, to do late night shopping. 50% of Londoners worked at home, and this was true in a couple of other cities during the pandemic, and how many will actually return to the office is unknown. In terms of restaurants, there's been this increase in Deliveroo, and also the formation of dark kitchens where restaurant-type banded meals are prepared and delivered to the home. And restaurants themselves, we're experiencing Monday closures. I experienced this problem myself in Brighton a couple of weeks ago. There were very few restaurants, in fact, virtually none, open after 9 o'clock or on Monday evenings because they can't get the staff. And the restaurants are also operating very strict cancellation policies. So you have to give your credit card details and they will take money if you don't actually turn up. So there's a lot of precarity in the restaurant industry. So there are these forces shrinking down nightlife, conventional nightlife. But against that, we can argue that there's been a permanent change to leisure patterns. The generation that experienced clubbing when they were 20s are now in their 40s, 50s. They're probably earning more money. And in fact, I think it's quite interesting, the nightmares tend to come from that generation and tend to be committed to keeping nightlife open. So there will be a strong push to keep nightlife open, and also recognition by public authorities of the economic value. There's an increase in the graduate population who have become used to nightlife during their student years, and also a rise in creativity because they've been involved in creative work, in gaming, in computer sciences, in hospitality, event management. And so they'll want to carry on being practitioners. And then there's a new awareness, or maybe this is a little more tendentious, but certainly concern about social isolation during the pandemic. So on the health side, a greater recognition of the importance of social contacts. So maybe that scenario won't quite pan out like that. Then there's the other scenario that's it's a blip. In a couple of years, we'll be back to where we were and nothing will have changed. So in a UK context, this means a concentration of nightlife in city centres, because that was happening before with terms of clubs, bars, venues, a decline in the suburban centres and local pubs. There's been for about the last 10 years, a whole series of seminars, government proposals, etc., about the decline of the high street. The promotion of world-class nightlife as the dominant mode, the neoliberal approach to nightlife, that we look at, the world-class and big business, a gentrification happening throughout nightlife, as was evident in the growth of the micro-pub movement, where vacant units got formed to cater for mainly middle-aged white men. Some very amusing papers about that, and also an increase in casual dining, expansion of the experience economy, major events and all sorts of festivals, international tourism, and on the downside, an encroachment on natural habitats and wildlife. But there may be arguments to say that won't happen, that international tourism won't pick up in the same kind of way. And also with COP26 happening in the UK, there is, and the rise of the green movement, there'll be moves to actually reduce international flights, which fuel international tourism. I've already mentioned the continuation of working from home, and that will have an enormous impact on public transport. Even if people, office workers, go back 4 days a week, that's a 20% reduction in the use of public transport services. And certainly this is something that's really worrying transport for London. Then the rising prices of food, energy, we only had an announcement today that there may be £1,000, that's €1,000, $600 a year increase in the average household's expenditure on gas. And that will have an impact on the amount of disposable impact that people have to go out with, or go to festivals, or go to events. And there's some evidence, but it's not very convincing, that there has been a household relocation to smaller towns. And there's a lot of chatter about the 15-minute city, about formulating about how cities will be repurposed. I know Paris has picked this up, so that neighborhoods will be focused around a 15-minute radius. Whether this is happening or will happen is a bit more uncertain. So my expectation is that the new normal will mean that there will be an absolute reduction in the number of buildings, number of venues, number of dance floors, number of pubs, numbers of cinemas. I don't know how they're going to keep going. I went to the cinema on Tuesday in Shoreditch. It was 25% full. I don't know, really don't know how they're going to keep going. Theatres, and we talked about shops, increase in the number of vacant buildings, and we don't know where they'll be. They may not be concentrated. There may be very large headquarters buildings that become empty because they redundant office space, and a scattering of local venues, bars, former bars, all sorts of different buildings. Reduction in public transport, increase in cycling, scooters to get around, and a move to a more hybrid kind of space. Different kind of practices, relationship between home and work, seeing a more permanent shift. possibly more underground experimental activities because of more creative people, wanting to do things. And I think quite possibly a reduction in the post-midnight activities. And I think it was the paper on LGBTQ venues talked about the kind of attachment people felt to nightlife during the pandemic. And I think that is very likely to stay and to become more important and to particular kind of practices. And the more optimistic view is that we have some changes in governance that will help facilitate a more hybrid, fluid new normal. We've had changes in England that make things like road closures, a flexible use of space become much more possible, allowances for longer retail hours. We had a fascinating paper earlier about outdoor markets, which have also been proposed. And two of the examples were in fact from inner London in Bermondsey. And some of the temporary bike lanes may become permanent. So we could see a kind of revitalization of local high streets through this flexible regulation, probably in gentrified areas, with an increase in with a continuation of outdoor casual dining. And we might see some more experimentation that was pre-pandemic, but maybe we'll get more of a boost now. Things like board game cafes are becoming quite popular, and some game called Warhammer I've never heard of, but seems to be opening up at the moment. And again, in different places. Croydon has one of these. This is a photo from Croydon on the left, and the other one's actually from Bristol and Cardiff. And with repurposed and hybrid spaces, there's been quite a lot of chatter about that, but actually few real examples. One is in Edinburgh, where a department store has become a sort of showcase for Johnnie Walker whiskey. So it's retail and bars and a rooftop bar. So it's nightlife as well. And the other more localized example comes from Croydon, one of my case study areas, where an alternative community venue was kept going during the pandemic, and actually it's not hybrid so much because it's split. It's a co-working space in one particular space they've rented, and then they've repurposed an old computer store to form a bar, cafe, live music venue. And live music is very important to Matthew's Yard. And in fact, they had issues about that. So there are these renewed opportunities. We might be able to see some non-commercial, more locally based nighttime activities, being able to make use of the vacant buildings for things like choirs, different kinds of social gatherings. We've now got guidance. We might have more willingness to use lighting to help to incorporate that part of planning and encourage experimentation and diversity. But the challenges are of austerity, about rising prices, about the decline in places for sociability, for low income demographic, and so an absolute increase in inequalities. And so that could become quite difficult, that, people going to that gentrified high street might have to walk past homeless people begging on the corner because they'll be have nowhere else to go. So that is quite a threat. So in terms of building back better in urban design, these are my suggestions, and actually will form the framework for my research. In the fieldwork is actually looking at an audit of local and regional nighttime activities, because we know nightlife operates across a region and just not in this 15-minute walkable space. Looking at the form, the practices, the meanings. And one of the difficult things will be trying to assess the latent and hidden demands that aren't catered for, that could be because we're trying to build for a better future where we allow for a diversity of people and a diversity of activities. And also an argument to illustrate for designers to illustrate how the areas they propose will actually operate at night. Where will be the movement corridors? Where do they think the hubs of attraction will be? Where will be the quiet places? Where will be the noisy places? And to make visual representations of these. So I've gone over my 30 minutes. Sorry about that. But I'd like to throw out a question to you because you come from different parts of the world. I'm based in Southeast London. I've been very confined there, or partly, or confined to England anyway, during this whole pandemic period. I'd really be really interested in how you see your new normals panning out over the short to long term. And also do say if you would disagree or you think I've got something wrong or I've missed something out. I'd be really interested to hear your views. Thank you very much.